Hello, good afternoon, and thanks for being here today for this webinar with us. It's 4:30 in the afternoon, so it's been a long day for everyone. So I'm really grateful that you're here today listening to me about Invalsi. Two things before we get into the main topic. Who am I and why am I talking to you, and why did we choose this topic and this title? My name is Marco, and I've been working with Macmillan for the past 18 months or so and collaborated with Mondadori. But prior to this, I had been working for 15 years in England as a head department in secondary schools, and after 15 years of working there, I moved back to Italy. As I was working in the UK, in England in particular, my job was that of a teacher, preparing students for standardized exam, just like Invalsi. And I was also an examiner for one of the exam boards in England. Therefore, I was well into the preparation of these exams, which is why I'm here talking to you about Invalsi and how to approach the test and how to approach its preparation. Who I am not someone from Invalsi, and I'm not someone that's here to tell you how to teach. This is not my objective, and I wouldn't do that. I didn't like, when I was in the UK, to be told how to teach because I thought I had some knowledge about it. I was always open to suggestions, but my point is not telling you how to teach. It's just to give you some hints, a few bits of advice for you maybe to use in your classroom. Second item is, why did we choose this title with Mondadori? Because as we traveled last year through Italy with my colleagues here in Mondadori and Macmillan, and we talked to teachers about Invalsi, we realized that it was a really hot topic for everyone, and it was causing more than a few trouble really for everyone, teachers and people working in schools and students. And we thought that having visited a lot of you around Italy and having had the results of Invalsi finally, it would be a good idea to see what could be done this year to improve the teaching if possible, improve the results of the students if possible, and make your life a bit easier looking at what we can learn from last year's results and from the Invalsi report that, as I'm sure you know, has been published and I'm sure you have already read. Now, let's start and let's have a look at the first slide. And what I was quite surprised about wasn't so much the 96.4% attendance that Invalsi boasted about on the report, but the fact that Invalsi congratulated the students about it. Obviously, the students did well in attending the test and sitting it, but I thought that it was a bit cheeky of Invalsi not to congratulate the teachers, because if the students turned up and did a test that was not compulsory last year, let's remember, it was mostly probably down to you and the coordinators in the school and the people that worked in school, and make sure that all the students actually walked into the computer rooms to do this test. As I was saying before, this was definitely one of the hotter topics that we discussed with teachers around Italy. With Mondadori, we traveled around Italy. We talked to teachers in Bergamo, Milan, Turin, Rome, Florence, and in different other areas of Italy. And three were the items that were discussed the most and that worried teachers the most. The first one was the fact that Invalsi was not compulsory. That meant for them that it was very difficult to motivate students to sit the exam and prepare it. Students didn't see why they would prepare for something that would count for nothing in their own eyes. There was also then the problem of the time constraints. Now, this meant for many teachers that having to prepare Invalsi for the fifth year, and we're talking about the fifth year in secondary school, meant taking away time from preparation time for the maturità. So it was something that they saw more as a obligation, something that was forced upon them, and it probably was, than anything that had been discussed with them and shared with them and explained to them how to prepare for, and therefore find the right time to prepare students. And so this was a big worry for a lot of you, those of you that attended those meetings and for the people that we talked to in the different sessions. And then there was the duration. Now, the duration of the exam, duration of the exam both for the reading and for the listening, but in particular for the listening. Many of the teachers that we met were really worried about the listening specifically, and in particular about its duration. Asking us, although we were not from Invalsi, we still are not, how people thought that students that would find difficult to sit through a few minutes exercise in listening could possibly sit through a 60 minutes exam. And these were three of the main worries that we were presented by teachers when we traveled around Italy. And I did partly share them, I have to say, maybe entirely. And it was something that really, really worried teachers. And understood why. And I still understand why they worry you. So having said that, these were the first few things that came up and the first few things that came up from teachers as well. And what I think was also interesting were the expectation, which from Invalsi, which were basically expecting all secondary school students coming out of the 5th year of the secondary school in English at a B2 level. Now, what most teachers, actually all teachers, told us was that it was a very, very generic expectation that didn't really take in consideration the reality of things in schools, in classrooms, and around Italy. Mostly because there was considered to be the target for all students in all regions and in all schools. Now, we know that Invalsi said there would be a questionnaire that would basically allow to work out the background of students and schools to then be able to measure the results that would be obtained once the Invalsi test had been completed. Now, that was the case. The questionnaire was completed and students completed, schools completed, and Invalsi took it in. But then was that maybe a contradictory message sent out? Because eventually the results came out, and what was stigmatized in the press in particular was how the results ended up being and where the highest and lower results came from. And there was not really an analysis of why those results were the way they looked. So could we say that those results and those expectations were unfair? Now, again, when we traveled around Italy, what a lot of the teachers told us was that it was a bit unfair to ask all students in all schools, regardless of the background, regardless of the schools they were in, was it a liceo linguistico, was it classico, was it professionale, to expect them to have, in the end, all the same result. In particular, when we think that it is true that Invalsi is made of 2 B1 exercises and 3 B2, but it's also true that if we look at other countries where the standardized exam is the norm, you have 2 tiers. For example, when I was teaching in England, what I had to do, obviously in collaboration with the students and the families, was to decide whether the student was ready to sit a higher tier or a lower tier, a higher or a foundation as it was called. Now, it is true that the higher tier will probably allow the student to reach a grade 9, which was the very top, but could also make him fall down to the very bottom, a level 1. But it gave the impression that the student was able to sit there and therefore was allowed to sit it. At the same time, if someone was a bit weaker, then there was a choice of using a foundation, meaning that the student was, yes, stopped at a level 5, but was tested at probably the level that he was better at. So these were the questions that were raised as well when the expectations were raised and published and shared with everyone. So when the results came out, the questions were obviously kept. Now, the reality of things was this, that the overall B2 level was reached 65% in the north, 52% in the center, and 34% in the south and the islands. Now, what happened when these results were first leaked and then published was that the press jumped on them and started coming to conclusions. I hardly found a proper analysis of what the results were and why they were like that and what happened, etc., etc. So the first thing that came out was failure, basically. That's what was published by the press, considering that the overall result was lower than expectation. And as we said before, were the expectations actually fair? Now, some of you are asking questions already, and we'll see them later. For example, someone is asking, not all my students will get a B2 level, so what can I do? Well, this is what we're trying to have a look at today. Is the expectation of a B2 fair, and should we all work at getting students to reach a B2? Now, that's the final objective, but can we all reach it? So we'll see today what we could do in the classroom to get all students to perform at the best, whether it's going to be a B1 or a B2. We'll see that later. So going back to the results, as we said, these were the overall results that came back. Now, what was interesting though was looking at the results in reading and listening, which together then gave this overall score. I say it was interesting because it did match what were the worries of a lot of you in the meetings that we had and that you shared with us, not just live when we met you, but also through webinars. Now, these were the reading results. I'm sure you've seen them. They were published back in the summer in the press, and you can find them on the Invalsi report as well. What is obvious is that the reading exam, or better, the reading test, the reading part of the Invalsi, show that in certain areas the results are obviously better than others, but still no one, or better, no regions have students reaching B2 at 100%. What can be seen, and I think that that's where we should really analyze the scores and what we should look at, is that in areas where students have a chance of being introduced to bilingualism, or in areas where we know the number of students working outside of schools for certifications, which is higher in certain areas than others, have obviously reached better scores than in regions where they cannot access this. There are areas of Italy where we know it is difficult for students because of facilities, because of background problems and issues, to actually access all of this. Therefore, even if the reading test gave better results overall, and better certainly than the listening, still the scores weren't as high as the expectations wanted us to get to. So if the reading was like this, and you can see the numbers, and I'm sure that you've seen them, you've analyzed them in your own time, what were the scores of the listening, and where the worries that a lot of you had actually justified? Well, looking at these scores, they certainly were, because as you can see, they're even lower than the reading results. Once again, they kind of match what happened in the reading. We still have regions where bilingualism is common and students do better. We have regions, in particular in the north, where we know that there's a high proportion of students accessing exams out of school where students are doing better. And once again, we have regions where students, because of lack of facilities, possibilities of accessing these exams, and even economical possibility to sit this exam and complete the courses, do fare worse. Now, what I found in the analysis of Invalsi was really a snapshot of this. So it was really talking about what the numbers were saying, but not really an analysis, or really getting into an analysis of that. The press stopped at analyzing the difference between north, south, and maybe center, something that will lead us into more a sociological analysis than an analysis regarding the results and what we can do to improve the students' performances in the Invalsi and in a test like that, in a standardized exam. Let's remember this, standardized exam. Now, what I looked at and what I was interested in was, why was the listening so low? Is it always this slow, from primary down to secondary? And what I found really interesting was that at the end of primary school, only an overall 12.5% in the north and centre and 24.5% in Southern Islands do not reach the required A1 level. So we have the opposite, where we have a far lower proportion of students not reaching the results than reaching it. Which is the opposite of what happens in Invalsi in the 5th year of secondary school, where we expect them to reach a B2. Two other things came up. As you analyze the results from primary to middle school to secondary school, the results get worse. Students move forward in the studies and they actually perform worse than better in the standardized exam, in listening, in English. And the gap between regions widens. So why is that, and what can we do about it? Now, a few things that I read. One of the first justifications that I found, which I did find, and I have to say a bit ridiculous, was that someone said, well, obviously they do better because A1 is easier than B2. Now, it is true that A1 is easier than B2, but it is also true that this A1 level exam is administered to students that are far younger than those that will sit later on in the 5th year of secondary school. So we cannot really report the A1 to the B2 when we have such a difference in age. There's also someone that said that the reason is because people don't have a chance to access exams out of school, and therefore is a problem of economical background. It could be, but it doesn't justify the whole thing. Invalsi went to the point of saying that it is down to the difference in the quality of teaching. Or maybe the fact that some students have access to preparation outside of school. Now, we could partly accept these 2 points. But I think they're writing them and they're not analysing them, and actually spending time in working out what these actually means is again a bit off. A bit like in the first slide when we said that Invalsi congratulated students but not really the teachers for turning up at the exam. Now, it is true, it's undeniable that there is a difference in the quality of teaching. There's always been and there always will be. Now, whether that justifies such a big gap in achievement, that could be discussed. Now, I was the head of the department, as I said, in England, and my job was that to monitor the quality of teaching. And I did see difference in quality of teaching amongst the people in my staff. When Ofsted, who still is, the group of inspectors, as they're called, Her Majesty's inspectors, they came into schools to assess the quality of teaching within all kind of schools. They did obviously find a difference in the quality of teaching. Now, would that justify such a big gap? I do not think so. Can we say that the results are down to the fact that in the north students have access to far more qualifications, for example, academic qualifications they would do in the south? Maybe, but once again, it would be a very big gap to justify with just this point. So what can we do then to improve the listening results of our students? Is there anything that we can do, really? We'll see that in the next few slides later on. Above all, towards the end of this webinar, we will talk about what we can do to improve our students' listening results. Once again, this is what I used to do when I was teaching in England, and it did work. I would though tell you that you need to take what I'm saying with a bit of a pinch of salt, as we say in English. It doesn't mean that what I'm saying is not correct. What it means is that I used to prepare my students from the very first year of secondary school and all the way up to the last year in the same way, which meant that when they got to the end, they were absolutely prepared and ready to sit a standardized exam. So that's something you need to consider when I show you what I would plan to do in my classrooms. I will consider that I'd be doing that from the very beginning. Whereas you were in a very different situation last year. You have been told to prepare Invalsi, you find yourself in the last year of school having to prepare that exam at the last minute, and not by any fault of your own. That's just how it was. So we'll see that later on, though, but we'll discuss this obviously. What the Invalsi report does not say clearly, though, is the following. To prepare students efficiently and effectively for a standardized exam, and I say this by experience, I prepare students through standardized exams for 15 years. Now, just to give a bit of background, in case anyone doesn't know how it works in UK, not just in England, but it's the same in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, albeit with slight differences between the four countries making part of the kingdom. All students have to complete standardized exams for any subject, above all a GCSE. GCSE is the exam that students sit at age 16, and students are prepared for this exam from year 7 when they're coming into secondary school up to year 11 when they are 16. So the preparation starts from the very start to the very end. So students are absolutely trained to sit standardized exams. They know exactly how they work, the timings, the fault pits, the risks, the tricks that they need to complete these exams. And we used to teach them the skills and strategies, and we'll talk about them later, to complete these exams. Now, when they went to sit their A-levels, what they would find was a part, again, standardized, and one part which is similar to the Maturità. So, once again, I can talk by experience, but again, my experience was that of someone that was really, really deeply into the preparation of standardized exams. So again, please consider what I tell you as suggestions, but I'm not here to tell you that what I was doing is what you would transport here in Italy. Partly you could, and maybe you should, but I'm not expecting you to overhaul the way you teach just because I'm saying so. I know you wouldn't either. Now, just to go back to the slide that we have here, to prepare students efficiently, in my opinion, effectively, first thing is training them. For a standardized exam, students need to be trained. What does it mean? It means that they need to know from the very start what the questions will be like. Now, luckily we know what all the exercises in Invalsi are going to be. Although we thought we did, and then we had a surprise, but we'll talk about it later. And we need to teach them what the examiners want them to do and what the examiners are trying to do to trick them, because that's what examiners do. I used to be part of AQA, who's one of the two bigger boards in England for, well, let's say 3, but 2 of the biggest ones, to administer exams in the UK. And our job was that of tricking students, if possible, by inserting questions phrased in a way that would show that the student really was prepared for that exam. So that is the job of the teacher, training the students for these exams, training them to understand the skills they need and the strategies needed, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Teach them what Teach teachers what, give them time, give time to the teachers. So, how long does a teacher in Italy need to prepare the Invalsi? How long does he or she need to prepare his or her students for the Invalsi? Definitely more than you had last year. Considering that when you get to the end of the courses of studies, you need to prepare them with literature. Some of you have got microlingue as well, so we know you have a lot to do. And expecting you to be able to prepare students in a few months, as it was the case last year, for B1 and B2, when, as you did tell us, a few of your students, actually maybe in some cases more than a few, would find it difficult to even complete an A2, was a real challenge. So, time for you needs to be made, and this was not really mentioned, at least I couldn't see that in the Invalsi report. There must be time for the students, because students cannot possibly prepare for an exam like that without having time put aside for them to understand how that has to be dealt with, and how they can tackle the questions and the exercises. Prepare the vocabulary knowledge that is necessary, which doesn't mean rota learning necessarily, but what they need to do. You should also be given effective data analysis, which should be readily and easily accessible. Now, when I was in England, I could log in into the AQI or Edexcel website and be given all sorts of spreadsheets and results and numbers and figures about how a cohort, for example, from 2014, tackled exercise 4 of the reading exam. And why would I do that? Because that allowed me to understand how many students perform well in that specific exercise. And I would also have an analysis of the overall country, which told me exactly in which exercise students perform better and where they perform worse. And they helped me working out where I had to focus. Was that the multiple choice exercise where I had students to insert one sentence? Was it the B1 exercise where they have short sentences which require the students to understand maybe one word, but where in the answers there are synonyms? Therefore, I had to tackle that. So all of these was available, and that's what you would need. And you also need to be told or suggested or offered the material to prepare the students in class, and to assign this material to students so they can prepare at home. Now, we will look today at one piece of material, maybe two actually, which I think I could suggest to be used to prepare your students for learning English, but also preparing for the Invalsi test and test in general. So we'll see that later. But I think that you being told what material you can use for that is really, really important. And maybe there would be more, but we can really say everything you would need, because otherwise we would spend far more than the next 30 few minutes here talking about what you need to do. But I think that these would be really, really important if you were given these bits of information. I think they would benefit you, benefit your students, and you would definitely help them perform better. Now, how can we prepare the students then for Invalsi? We're talking about what you need as teachers. What can we as teachers do to help the students to perform well? Now, we don't, as in, I don't expect you to teach students for Invalsi. I didn't teach my students for the GCSE. I didn't teach them for A-level. What I mean is that I did teach them French or Italian or Spanish, because that's what I used to do. But the exam standards were the same. The questions were exactly the same. I would invite you to go on the website of AQA and Edexcel in England, and you would find the same exact graphic and type of questions used for Invalsi and for other standardized exams that you would administer your students in Italy. And you don't teach your students for that. You would teach them English like you normally do, but you would embed in your lessons the skills and strategies that they would need. That's what I used to do. So it's something that you would have to do from the very start. Now you know that Invalsi apparently is here to stay. I say apparently because we know that in Italy things change quite quickly, and at the moment we think that Invalsi is here and it will stay as the, let's say, main test for our students for the next few years. Therefore, preparing students for Invalsi has to be something that starts from the first year in school, or maybe at least from the biennium, maybe the second year, but definitely not from the fifth year, when they, in the situation you were in last year, because it will be too late. Students need to be prepared from the start, what they need to face, and when they will get to the fifth year, you will need to spend time preparing them for the exam. You can dedicate your time to do something else. The strategies and skills will be there already. Listening, reading, and grammar should be embedded in every lesson if possible. Now, I know you don't have time. I know that. I know you're busy. I know you got many things to do. I know you have to teach literature later. I know you don't have that many lessons in a week. I'm aware of that. And I also know that grammar is something that is always taught in Italy, and teachers expect to teach it, and students expect to learn it, even when they are older and going to other schools. They expect to be taught grammar. Now, these 3 skills have to be embedded in, if possible, every possible lesson, let's say, rather than in every lesson. They need to work on vocabulary. Now, this doesn't mean rota learning. What I mean is that I learned English, French, Spanish, and German by learning long list of vocabulary. I did that and it worked fine for me because I was that kind of student. I was able to do it. And many people that are listening to me today probably were in the same situation. But we now know, and I learned that as well when I was in England, that not everyone learns like that. Many students learn by vocabulary by being given vocabulary in a context because it's easier for them to remember it. So above all, for standardized test, yes, you can give them long list of vocabulary. But because the Invalsi and standardized tests are so based on vocabulary and on synonyms, antonyms, if you give them long list of vocabulary, it won't be enough. It will be used. You need to help them by putting this vocabulary into a context, which will help them remembering later on where they learned those items. The test you administer them need to mirror what the actual standardized exam asks of your students. Because testing students is fine. We all did it, and rightly so. But giving them tests just to test them obviously leads to nothing. Above all, then now you know what a test looks like, or at least we think we know. We'll see why we say that later. So you need to find the right material, and this takes me to the 6th point, which offer the necessary preparation in terms of skills, vocabulary, grammar, strategies, and test. There isn't much point in going and find tests who have exercises that got absolutely nothing to do with what they're going to do in a few years' time. Yes, it helps them. Yes, it puts students out of the comfort zone. Yes, you can do it, but really, you haven't got much time. So stick to what you know you need. Now, strategies and mastering time should be the norm. Now, by strategies, we're talking about, for example, learning how to understand where the examiner has put something that's going to try to make the students make a mistake, how they phrase sentences to make sure that they make a mistake, how they, in a multiple choice, give more options than they need, which is something that Italian students are not necessarily used to, and teach them to time themselves or time the test all the time, so that when they get to the end of the course of studies, they know exactly how long they need and will take them to sit the exam, and how long they will have left, because they will have time left, in particular in the reading, obviously, to go through the answers. And one thing that I talked about when I was traveling around Italy last year and talked to teachers about, differentiation, which takes me back to the first question I was asked by some of you following this webinar about students not getting a B2. What can we do? Now, all of you have students in your classroom that are not at a B2 grade now, and you know, because you know your students, they probably will never get to a B2. I know it's probably unfair and a bit harsh to say that, but you know that you will have maybe someone in your classroom for whom the B2 will be a mirage, impossible to be reached. So what can you do? Can you give this boy or this girl an exercise B2 level no matter what, because he or she needs to prepare the Invalsi? Can you give a student a B2 test when he or she gets to this 5th or 4th year of school, knowing full well that he or she won't be able to tackle not even maybe the first paragraph of that text, or maybe the second, and complete maybe 2 questions? Can you ask them to just complete the test and put some random answers, because in any case you don't lose any points? Could you do that? Obviously not. Now, differentiation becomes important. By differentiation in England, we meant offering the same exercise, but with different objectives, different skills to be tested, and maybe different ways of tackling it. Now, we used to say that it wasn't time consuming, it was time demanding. What is the difference? A lot of people think that time consuming means that something that takes away time from other things, that is a waste of time. Well, differentiation is not. It is time demanding. It asks you sometimes to take an exercise from a book, I'm not saying you need to make up your own exercises at all. There's enough out there on the market for you to find what you need everywhere. But what it means is taking an exercise and varying it slightly to offer a chance to all your students to access it. Leave it as it is for the more able ones, maybe make it even more difficult for the even more able ones, or change it slightly for those that are least able. That way they can all access it, they can all do something, and you will train them. The worst thing you can do is not pushing your students over the limit, is asking your students to do something that is over their ability at that very moment. If you do that, you risk of losing them. They think that failure is the norm and they will accept failure as a standard, which should not be the case. So differentiating some of the exercise you offer in class does become really, really important. Now, this leads me then to answer that question that was asked at the start. What can you do if a student doesn't get to a B2? Well, if he or she doesn't get to a B2, you know he or she won't. Well, then I know that maybe you shouldn't be saying that. But if he or she can't, then she won't be able to. We all full well know that not everyone at the moment, next year, in 2 years' time, will reach a B2 all over Italy. Maybe in 10 years, who knows? Maybe in 15, maybe even less than that, maybe in 5, they will. At the moment, maybe not, because the changes that are required for you to be made in class to teach the Invalsi are so many. You might not have the chance to train all the students coming through in year 1 of the secondary schools to the last one to succeed. But then differentiate your exercise to give them all a chance to reach that possible level. Now, what can we do then to prepare our students then for the Invalsi? What I have done is to answer a few of the questions that I was asking before, what I would need to perform well or to have my students to perform well in class, and in particular what material I should use. So obviously you could say I'm biased, and probably I am, but what I did was I looked at the material that Mondadori had on offer with Macmillan for English. And what I thought was the most logical solution would be to pick a book at B1 level. So these, what you will see is B1. There's obviously the B2 as well, which you could use, and which offers exercises that match the requirements of the Invalsi, because that's what I would be doing. Now, I did find it, and it's optimized. So optimized B1 is at the B1 level, allows students to perform at their level. All the exercises are mapped to their level, and they're mapped to not just the B1 Cambridge exam, but Invalsi as well. So I know that what I will find there will allow my students to perform well and to prepare for the exam, both skill-wise and strategy-wise, and vocabulary, which is really, really important, and also grammar. I don't forget grammar. I know you will see very little of it today, and you would expect to see more. I know the teachers in Italy love teaching grammar, and so did I. I was one of those in England that taught grammar to students, not implicitly but explicitly, because I think that you need the scaffolding to create sentences, and you cannot do that if you don't know grammar. But the point for me today is to show you what kind of exercise you could do to prepare your students. So again, I'm not taking away grammar, I'm not taking it away from you, nor I want to. I'm just saying that grammar is there, needs to be taught, but in some cases it might not be the main feature of your lesson. So let's just say that I am preparing my students for, in this lesson, for some skills they will need and strategies they will need for the Invalsi. And what I did was picking this topic about shopping. Now, I didn't pick it randomly, and I didn't pick this title randomly either. There was a reason why I did that. A, because I thought the shopping was, well, a good topic we could talk about, but also appeals to everyone. I never believed that there were topics that, above all in school books, would appeal more to boys than girls. Because let's be fair, we all know that, yes, maybe girls like shopping, but boys do like it just as much. So there's no reason why they wouldn't do that. And the interesting thing, though, wasn't so much just the shopping, but it was this expression, shop till you drop. So from the very start, you offer this to your students. What you're offering them is to work on an idiom, an expression which is used by British people very often, which is found regularly in communication, in advertisement, etc., which is real English. And this is the kind of English that they will find in Invalsi. If you've seen the Invalsi test last year, the material that is on offer, the language that is used is the English that English people speak. Now, it might not be the English that is spoken in the pub, but it's definitely the English that is spoken normally by British people. So, Shop Till You Drop was a very good thing to use as a title, because it allows me then to ask students what it means, and if they've seen this expression before. And after a little bit of conversation, I've given them a context. So, as I said before, context is key, because my vocabulary will be linked to this. I can then work on the first exercise, which is this one, which is asking students to work on idioms and work out what those idioms actually mean. So I'm offering them the chance to work onto real language. Now, I'm not just doing it because I want them to be able to go to England and speak like that, but because I know that that's the kind of language that Invalsi will offer. Now, after I've done this exercise, actually, let me say, you can see that I started with, in the book, is considered as exercise 3. Now, it means that I am not following religiously the book either. I'm not going from exercise 1 all the way down to exercise 10 and just doing what the book says. I'm using the book because it's there for me to be used. So I'm going to work on that. Now, what I will do is that I will use this exercise. I will have worked on that, and I will have introduced my topic and giving them a little bit of context and a bit of real language to use. Once I've completed, well, they have completed and I work with them through this exercise, I can move on and work on this one. Now you can see that I'm going back to exercise 1, which was really the first exercise that the book asked me to work on. But I thought that because of the title, it would be a good idea to keep the idea going of the idiom. So now I can go back to my context and ask my students to work in pairs, to work in groups or individually. You know how students can work. You know if they can work in pairs, if they can work in groups. If the class would be too boisterous, you don't want them to do it, and you might just want them to do a quiet exercise in writing. And list all the shops they know. Now, it sounds like a very simple exercise, but if you think of the number of shops that are in the vocabulary in English, you know there's a lot. And there will be just a few that they know, but you will need to make sure that they know more than just a few. Once they've done that, I can then ask them to work out what is sold and what you can buy there. Now, why would I bother doing that? Because I'm extending the vocabulary even further. I'm not just stopping at the shops, I'm then going down one step and seeing what is on sale there. Now, it is true that a long list of vocabulary will come up, but they're producing it. You are basically taking their suggestions and you're sharing it with everyone and you're giving them a context. Yes, there will be a long list. Yes, some of them will learn it as rota learning. You will ask them to learn them by heart probably, and rightly so. But a lot of the people will remember quite a lot of this vocabulary because it's been put into a context, the context of shopping. Now, I then get to the text. This is the text that, again, is in the same page or same double spread of the book. And what can we do with that? How can we approach it? What can we do with this text? Now, shall we just jump into it? Shall we ask our students to work through the book because there's an exercise? It depends on your students. You could decide that your students are able to do that, and therefore you could let them just do the exercise as it says in the text. Should we consider differentiating it maybe? I would personally, or at least if I think of the classes that I used to teach, I would definitely differentiate and use the text as it is, but then maybe breaking it down into chunks and make it slightly easier for students to work on it, depending on the levels they have. Because let's remember one thing. If we look at the exercises in the Invalsi and in the standardized exams, very often, if not always, questions are asked paragraph by paragraph. So a student should never be asked to read through a whole text in one go, because he or she will ever hardly need to do so. He or she will probably need to work paragraph by paragraph. So what can I do to make it a bit easier for them? So I could split into paragraphs, make them work in chunks. And what I could do is, for example, to do a bit of differentiation. Maybe ask them to give a title to each paragraph, or you could offer titles for each paragraph. Now, it does create a bit of extra work in that case, but you are in that case matching the request of the Invalsi. There are exercises where students are asked to give a title to a paragraph of a text, which shows the understanding of the gist of it. So which means that you have, therefore, asked them to develop the skill of skimming. Okay, and to have a look at the text, work out what it talks about, and to understand the main idea that is into a paragraph. Now, do we want to extract keywords prior to the analysis of the text? Do we want to take keywords out so that when the students tackle it, are a bit more accustomed to the text itself? We could do that. We could maybe put it on the screen. Obviously, Optimize offers the option of having the presentation kit for the teacher, which means that you can show the students exactly what I'm showing you now, but you can work on it as if you had an interactive whiteboard without needing an interactive whiteboard, covering some keywords which you'd ask them to bring out or understand. What you could also do would be to work on these keywords and then maybe ask them to find synonyms for it. Now, why would you go through all of this? Because the work on synonyms and on vocabulary is key for the Invalsi exam and for all standardized exams. B1 exams, B2 exams, if you look at the text and then you look at the questions, hardly ever you will find a question which replicates the vocabulary found in the text. Very, very often, if not always, that question will be rephrased, paraphrased, or will be changed slightly so the student does not find the exact same words, which could make them then guess the answer. Or, very often, if the words are replicated, you can almost be sure, maybe let's say 70-80% of the time, there is a trick. What the examiner does is to use very similar vocabulary, if not the same, but redrafting a sentence so that the students think that that's the right option, chooses it, and makes a mistake. So that's another thing that you can do. So train students to understand why you're doing that. So why are we working on this? Because the question as to why are we bothering doing this, miss or sir, as they used to say in England, comes out very often. And that's the reason why. Because you are basically dissecting a text to make them understand how to approach it. So now that I've worked on this, now that I've thought over a few options, okay, to work on this text, I also need to think about what could I do if I had special educational needs in my classroom. So students that have special needs and cannot access the text or find it difficult or have issues with dealing in the way the text is being put onto the textbook, for example, or they have different needs. Now, we need to think of two things. The basis of Invalsi, or at least Invalsi, says that special needs have extra time to tackle reading. Now, there might not be enough for them to succeed in that. They also say that in some cases they could be exempted from the test, but that's extreme cases. Now, with Optimize, you can obviously take this text and print it and use it and reprint in a different way, changing the lettering, changing the size, changing the background to offer to special needs students if that's the need they have. If you're talking about different needs, then what you can do is through differentiation, offering them a slightly different exercise that will allow them to access the same text as the others, maybe part of it, maybe with a bit of extra time to access the exercise. So it is unfortunately very often up to you as a teacher to adapt what you're given for these students. Now, only now, after I worked on this, I would get into the Invalsi mood really, although I have already a bit, and use this exercise, which is a typical Invalsi exercise where you have to complete these gaps with one of these options. And as we see, and as we know as teachers, and that we need to make aware the students of, there are more options than they need. Now, this always happens, and this puts off a lot of the students because they don't see why they would make two efforts rather than one. First one, finding out what goes into the gap, and second one, finding out which are the useless options. So this is something you need to train them at, and they need to be aware of. They will moan and complain every time, probably until the end of days they'll be in school with you, but you'll have to train them on that. Now, what is interesting in this exercise is not just that it matches the Invalsi and it says exam task, but also the grammar that is being embedded into the questions. So, as I was saying before, I might not be showing you how to do grammar exercise because you know how to do grammar exercises, you're the experts on this. But when you see he had been selling, you obviously know that that's a grammatical point that will need to be brought up later on because students need to know what it means. So it's not because you're preparing someone for a standardized exam, the grammar doesn't appear, does not have to be tackled. On the contrary, you've seen the exam last year, you know full well that you need to. Now, only now I'm going to the listening. And you could tell me that what I'm doing doesn't make sense because we said before that listening is what worries you the most, what has made students underperform the most. So why am I doing it only now? I never started a lesson with a listening exercise. You are free to do so. But very often I've seen that happening, about when I was in England. I've seen them being done here in Italy when I was observing lessons. And my question to all of these teachers was, and not a patronizing question, was why do you start with a listening exercise? And answers range from what I thought was not appropriate to the very appropriate one for what the teacher was doing. In one case, I was told, well, because if they need to do a listening exam, in any case, they will start with a listening exercise, so why not? It is true, but it's also true that when they get to do a listening exam, they probably had a few years of preparation before they did the test, so they know how to do it. Now, throwing students into a listening, in my opinion, without preparing them before, and by preparing them I mean having them understood what a topic is, having them been facing the language, is a bit unfair. And let's remember that you're preparing them for the exam, you're not testing them. So what you need to do is put them into the best possible position to be able to succeed in these exercises, so that when they do the test, they can actually do well. So what I would do personally, but feel free to disagree with me, would be to start with this very simple exercise. Now, again, it says exam skill here, you can see them. Optimize does give exam skill suggestions all the time, but I will start with a very simple one. Just listen to 4 extracts and match the speaker to the situation. Just focus to start with on who's doing this. Very, very simple. They will listen to this twice, because we know that in Invalsi, the students listen to each extract twice. Yes, the length is not the same, but as I said, we're preparing them for Invalsi, we're not testing them. So I'm not giving them a 5 minutes listening on a first listen I'm doing in class, because they will kill off the mood straight away. So after I've done this and listened to it twice, then I will move on to the next exercise, another listening. And I'm using the exactly same file. I'm not changing exercise. What I mean is I'm not changing the topic, I'm changing task. But the people talking are the same, they're talking about the same thing, it's the same exercise before, but what I'm asking students is to concentrate on different chunks of language. Again, I'm preparing them, I'm not testing them. So I'm giving them the chance to perform as well as they can to make sure that they leave the classroom convinced that they can do well. So by this time, once I finish this exercise, they've listened to the same file 4 times, they worked out who says what, and a bit more of information from each file. Once I've done that and I've discussed it with the students, I got feedback from them, I corrected it, then I go to the next exercise. It's another listening, and it's the same file again. So by the end of this exercise, they will listen to the same file 6 times. Now, they might find it boring, but what I can tell you is that they will find it very satisfying to be able to do this exercise at the end, because they've listened to it already 4 times by the time they get to this, 5 times by the time they get to the second listening of this exercise. They probably have heard some of this information as they were doing the other 2 exercises, so they'll probably be very quick at completing this. But that's the point. I want them to give them scaffolding not just for grammar, but also for listening, which is, I know, the weakest link in their preparation. And as I do this over and over again, my students will get to the end of the preparation for Invalsi or for any test or listen in general, being confident enough to be able to do these exercises. So the objective here is to make them face these exercises, get them to understand what they need to do, but not to make them fail. Yes, show them where they could fail. Yes, make them fail sometimes because they need to understand that they're not infallible, but at the same time give them the chance to do well and perform well. And there's no point in changing exercise all the time. So jumping from one file to the other, give them a 5-minute exercise to start the classroom and then another 7-minute exercise later on. Because what you want them to do is to increase their ability as you go along, okay? Now, what we're using now, again, is optimize. So these comes from optimize again. It's in the same topic. Unfortunately, when I prepared the slide, you couldn't see really the number there, but I reckon that this is around about 4 pages into the unit. So it's the same topic, but once again, I have not followed, as you can see, I'm going backwards. Here I have 2 and 3. This wasn't there. I have not followed the book religiously. Because as far as I'm concerned, the book, in this case Optimize, is a tool for me to prepare students. Everything is there. I didn't have to create anything. You can even show the book in class. You can show them exactly what I'm seeing now and press a button and the listening is there. So you don't need to create anything. It's just a matter of thinking logically, how do you want your students to progress through the lesson, and where do you want them to be at the end of your lesson or at the end of a cycle of lessons. That's another thing. Very often we've been asked by teachers when we traveled around Italy last year, but how can we cover all this in a lesson? Now, it is true that you have limited time. I understand it and I know you don't have time, really, you don't. But it doesn't mean that all of these exercises should be covered in 1 hour. You could cover them over 2 lessons if you have time. You could cover them in less than 60 minutes. It depends on the quality of your students and in the confidence you have to do so. But as I said, these are just suggestions. This is what I know I could have covered in a classroom when I was in England, but because my students were trained. So they were so used to this that for them doing this B1 exercise would be the norm. So I wouldn't even need to explain to them what to do by the second month of teaching them. They knew exactly what to do. They would get their exercise books out. I would just show them the exercise. They would already be writing 1 to 4 in the book and knowing what to do. So it's just a matter of training them. Now, having done all of this, depending on how your class has gone and how much time you have, I would probably have time to work on this exercise, which is phrasal verbs. Now, why am I jumping from reading and listening to this? Because although I'm not doing an explicit explanation of grammar, I know though that the topic is there and that students don't often see phrasal verb as grammar. We know that it is, the verbs, but students don't see it as such. They see them as extra vocabulary they need to learn. And phrasal verbs are one of the weakest points for students in Italy, but also abroad. And they need to know it. Invalsi has them everywhere. Standardized exam tests students on phrasal verbs all the time, and is where they expect students to make the most mistakes. Now, these are really the basis of many exercises, and they're there to trick them. So we could teach students and get students to learn them via rote learning. But if you do this exercise in a context, they could probably remember, some of the students will remember the sentence that is being used in and remember that verb, what it meant. Translation can be used. Once you've done this exercise and you've completed it, you could ask students to translate it so they remember the Italian and the English. Obviously, translation can be used. Why not? So learning these kind of verbs, phrasal verb, is fundamental. So I would advise you to have an exercise very often in your planning where these verbs come up. If they come in the context you're teaching, all the better, because trust me, it will be far, far easier to be learned by students in class. If I have more time, or if I have students that finish earlier the exercises, or if I want to set them a little bit of work as independent work or even at home, but I definitely want all my students to do so, I would keep this exercise or list of exercise as last. Not because it is the least important at all, but really because, again, it's very quick, it's very simple, and it allows students to practice vocabulary. Here you have the single word and the definition. Here you have, again, a definition of the words you have here. And again, you have how to use these very useful items of vocabulary into a sentence. And again, it's in a context. So it's an exercise that is found, again, towards the end of the unit. It says number 1, but it's exercise 1 later on in the unit. And it allows you to, again, reinstate the importance of vocabulary, but reinstating it into the context of shopping. So this is something that you will know whether to prepare for the lesson or to prepare as an extension work, or as a work for students that need to do specific on vocabulary, or to be set as homework. I would definitely want all my students to do it because all of them need to know the vocabulary. But once again, it says 1, but I haven't used it as the first exercise in the part of the lesson. I just picked it out because I thought I would need it. Now, I've been using Optimize here. I haven't been using an Invalsi preparation book on purpose. Now, why did I do so? We have published with Mondadori the Invalsi tutor, and other publishers have done the same, obviously, because such was the worry amongst you teachers that all publishers thought it would be a good idea to publish an Invalsi booklet. I would definitely use the Invalsi tutor, and I would use it in class, and at home as a homework in some cases, but I wouldn't use it as my sole means of preparation for students in class. Because these booklets normally contain 5 tests, and 5 tests go quickly. And because they are tests, I will keep them to prepare them for how the test should be run and get students to understand exactly what the test will look like when they get to the end of the preparation. So I will definitely use it in the 5th year of preparation, and I will use it later. Now, finally, let's have a look at some of the questions that I would expect you to ask, and I've seen actually some of you have asked in the question that came up from you attending this webinar. As I said, where is the grammar? I didn't put it here, not because I don't want you to teach it. You will have to teach grammar, and please carry on teaching it, because I have to say that amongst teachers around Europe, Italians are probably the better one at teaching and explaining it. Now, it has to be done. I'll show you an exercise before where a grammatical item came up and needs to be taught. But if you can embed it in a lesson like that, please do so. Dedicate time to it because you have to. But if you can, try and embed it again using the context that you're used to develop the lesson with. Whereas speaking and writing, some of you asked me before, yeah, but you focus on listening and reading. We know that Invalsi has it, but should we not teach speaking and writing? Of course you should. I haven't said that the other two skills should be left. On the contrary, what I'm saying is that listening, reading and grammar should be embedded as much as you can in your lessons from the very start to the very end of the course of studies for the students. But speaking and writing are fundamental because by listening to each other and to speaking to a teacher, some students learn far better because they learn by listening and to other people speaking. And writing is very useful as well because they actually practice putting together sentences which, if they produce, find them easier to remember. And writing will always have to be there, in particular for the maturità, when they will complete the exam at the end. Some of you are asking, well, I don't think I can do all of this in one lesson because there's far too many exercises. Again, I'm not here to tell you how to do your lessons. That wasn't my point. I would never be, because I would never dare telling you how to prepare your classes. My point was to show you what you could do in your classes to prepare for your students for the Invalsi test and for standardized exams. I think it's a long haul work. It's something that cannot be done over a few months. So from the very start of the secondary school to the very end, the students should be facing these kind of exercises. So it's very important as well, the material that you pick. Okay, the material that you choose to prepare your students is really, really important. So again, please pay attention to the material you offered and does it match your needs and your student needs in terms of preparation for the course, so for the biennial and triennial, and for the exam they need to sit at the end. Now, why didn't I use the Invalsi material in this case? I did, because Optimize does embed in its pages, Invalsi exercises, or exercises that you would find in Invalsi. So I haven't used Invalsi Tutor because, as I said before, as a question that came up from one of your colleagues, I think that Invalsi Tutor should be used at the end of the preparation as a means to get students fine-tuned to the requirements of the exam, not as the sole meaning of preparation for the exam itself. Then I left the last one, and no one's asked, but I thought I would talk about it, and it's the TFJ, the True, False and Justification, which is an exercise that I didn't expect to be in the Invalsi. I think that a lot of the editors here at Mondadori didn't expect to be, and I think that a lot of you and a lot of the students didn't expect to be in the Invalsi either. Now, the True, False and Justification exercise is a fairly simple exercise explained very poorly in the test, I have to say, whereby the student has to find out whether the statement is true or false that is given to them and look into a text and write the first four words, I think, to justify their answer. Now, these 4 words come from the text itself, and students need to work out whether the options given to them are correct or not, and they need to prove that. Now, I didn't insert it in there because it is something that has come up recently that the editors here at Mondadori are working on and will introduce in a new booklet that will be published later on, I think, for Invalsi. And I think that is something that you have seen is available on the Invalsi feedback, and I would suggest that you start preparing your students at. But it also means that we were given a list of exercises we expected to be in the test last year, but Invalsi decided to insert something that we didn't expect. So it's what we can call the unexpected. Expect the unexpected. It's something that we didn't expect, but it's been put there. So should we therefore use exercises that are not in the Invalsi book? We should sometimes throw in an exercise that is not a standard Invalsi exercise, just so students are prepared to face exercises that they normally wouldn't do in class, they normally wouldn't be facing. Not because we know those exercises will come up, but because we know now, we're proof that Invalsi will throw in an exercise which we didn't expect. So that's why I didn't put it in, and that's my opinion. At least that's my opinion. You are free, obviously, to not agree with it and do it differently. Now, one of your colleagues is asking, again, for the title of the book we have shown before. The book is Optimize. It's published by Macmillan and distributed in Italy by Mondadori. It comes from levels from A2 to B2. And again, it's a book that helps you preparing students for their English course, biennial and triennial, but it's mapped against the Cambridge certifications and Invalsi adapted. So it's what I use today because I thought for the plan that we had to go through today was probably the most useful text that I could use today to show you what I could do in a classroom. So we are coming to the end of this webinar. It's been almost an hour, 15 minutes that we've been going. I appreciate your attention up to now. I know it's difficult, above all in a day like this. At least in Milan, it's raining really heavily, so it's dark and grey. It's the end of the day, we're all tired. I hope that the webinar has been informative. He has given you a bit more information, a few ideas you can take away and use in classroom. As I said, I was not expecting to overhaul your teaching experience and planning. That wasn't the plan at all. It was just to see what we've learned from last year's Invalsi and what could be done from here on to make your life a bit easier and improve your students' results in the next few years. So with this, I thank you all. I appreciate your attention. I wish you all a very good evening, and we're getting to Friday tomorrow, so one more day, then it's the weekend. All the best. Thank you very much. And from me here and from the guys here at Mondadori, they've been kindly helping us out. All the best, and have a good night. Thank you. Goodbye.